Dre here with the Beyond Peril YouTube channel, and today we are at The Guardian, theguardian.com, and I think this is a little bit earlier 2019 article, but we're going to talk about an example of how the media uses its words to manipulate you and change the way you think about things. This is a perfect example. So it's on climate change, of course, and the article is titled, "It's a Crisis, Not a Change. The 6 Guardian Language Changes on Climate Matters. A short glossary of the changes we've made to the Guardian Style Guide for use by our journalists and editors when writing about the environment." All right. In addition to providing updated guidelines on which images our editors should use to illustrate the climate emergency, we have updated our style guide to introduce terms that more accurately describe the environmental crisis facing the world. Our editor-in-chief, Catherine Beiner, said, "We want to ensure that we are being scientifically precise while also communicating clearly with readers on this very important issue. These are the guidelines provided to our journalists and editors to be used in the production of all environment coverage across the Guardian's website and paper. Number 1, quote, the climate emergency, end quote, or the, quote, climate crisis, end quote, to be used instead of, quote, climate change. Climate change is no longer considered to accurately reflect the seriousness of the overall situation. Use climate emergency or climate crisis instead to describe the broader impact of climate change. However, use climate breakdown or climate change or global heating when describing it specifically in a scientific or geophysical sense. Example, scientists say climate breakdown has led to an increase in the intensity of hurricanes." All right. So you see how they're trying to change the language to affect you emotionally, right? To show what they perceive as the state of the climate. And I mean, as if you haven't seen the previous videos, that would be a good place to start, because if you just assume that what you're hearing on these news channels and media outlets is true, then this isn't going to make much sense to you, because you're going to just be like, well, of course, there's an emergency. Of course they have to use this language. But no, they don't have to use this language, because the news should just be providing you with information as it is, not trying to manipulate you into believing a certain way that they believe you should believe, right? Number 2, climate science denier or climate denier to be used instead of climate skeptic. The OED defines a skeptic as a seeker of the truth, an inquirer who has not yet arrived at definite conclusions. Most climate skeptics, in the face of overwhelming scientific evidence, deny climate change is happening or is caused by human activity. So, denier is more accurate. Number 3, use global heating, not global warming. Global heating is more scientifically accurate. Greenhouse gases form an atmospheric blanket that stops the sun's heat escaping back to space. Number 4, greenhouse gas emissions is preferred to carbon emissions or carbon dioxide emissions. although carbon emissions is not inaccurate. If we're talking about all gases that warm the atmosphere, this term recognizes all the climate-damaging gases, including methane, nitrogen oxides, CFCs, etc. Number 5, use wildlife, not biodiversity. We felt that wildlife is a much more accessible word and is fair to use in many stories, and is a bit less clinical when talking about all the creatures with whom we share the planet. Number 6, use fish populations instead of fish stocks. This change emphasizes that fish do not exist solely to be harvested by humans. They play a vital role in the natural health of the oceans. Since we announced these changes, they have been reported widely, shared across social media channels, and even prompted some other media outlets to reconsider the terms that they use in their own coverage. Alright, so maybe we'll take a look at one of those. Their other story here, Guardian spurs media outlets to consider stronger climate language. Do you not see that this is propaganda? That this is to influence you into a position that you are told is true, and they just expect you to believe it without you using your mind and being a skeptic. They admitted it. They don't want you to be skeptic. They want you to believe what they're telling you. The Guardian's decision to alter its style guide to better convey the environmental crisis unfolding around the world has prompted some other media outlets to reconsider the terms they use in their own coverage. After The Guardian announced it would now routinely use the words climate emergency, crisis, or breakdown instead of climate change, because climate change, what does that even mean, right? The climate is always changing. That's the natural state of the world, is a climate which changes, right? But no, it's the climate emergency, or it's the climate crisis. It's the climate breakdown. A memo was sent by the Standards editor of CBC, Canada's national public broadcaster, to staff, acknowledging that a recent shift in style at the British newspaper The Guardian has prompted requests to review the language we use in global warming coverage. Senior CBC management told staff they were able to use the terms climate crisis and climate emergency when covering the wide-ranging impacts of temperature rises around the world. Neutrality is an important principle in our journalism, said Paul Hambleton, Standards editor of CBC News. We recognize that climate crisis and climate emergency are increasingly common expressions in debates over what to do about global warming. Catch that. Neutrality is an important principle and it should be in journalism in general. But they're not neutral, as we see here. Climate change and global warming offer a neutral starting point for that debate. Climate change and global warming offer a neutral starting point for that debate. But as with all our journalistic decisions, context matters. Along with the revised use of climate change, the Guardian's style guide also now favors global heating instead of global warming. Meanwhile, the term biodiversity is discouraged in certain instances to instead emphasize wildlife. We want to ensure that we are being scientifically precise while also communicating clearly with readers on the very important issue, said The Guardian's editor-in-chief Catherine Viner. The phrase climate change, for example, sounds rather passive and gentle when what scientists are talking about is a catastrophe for humanity. Scientists are talking about a catastrophe for humanity here, folks, you know? I don't know if we should finish this article because I have some clips. I think some of these clips might be referenced in this article. And this is pretty interesting though. Newsrooms around the globe have been digesting the changes, with journalists at several UK and US media outlets reporting internal conversations about the language used around climate. Laura Helmuth, the health, science, and environment editor at Washington Post, said there were no new guidelines at the newspaper as yet, but she had circulated the Guardian story about your guidelines to our reporters in copy desk for inspiration. The Los Angeles Times still uses climate change and global warming, but that may soon change. We are also reviewing our style guide in light of recent reports from the United Nations, said Scott Kraft, the managing editor of the LA Times, in reference to Stark report last year that found humanity must cut its planet heating emissions by nearly half by 2030 to avoid several escalating climate-driven disasters such as flooding, wildfire, and drought. Others are being more circumspect. We use various terms, climate change being the most frequent, and we strive to define what that means in the context of our stories, said a spokeswoman for the New York Times. The Guardian's new language around the environment is aimed at better illustrating a rapid breakdown in the natural process that drive the planet's climate and the society-wide danger that it represents. Without urgent intervention, global heating will reach a point where hundreds of millions of people are displaced by flooding, food insecurity, and unrest, while the degradation of landscapes has led to the potential loss of 1 million species and the unraveling of ecosystems that support human life. Whether a change in media tone will help address these problems remains an open question, given the general lack of focus on the topic. A general lack of focus on the topic of global warming. Yeah, right. A report this week found that major US TV networks spent far more news time on the birth of Archie, the new British royal baby, than a report warning of 1 million species extinction. One network, ABC, covered Archie for longer in 1 week than it spent in the whole of 2018 on the climate crisis. All right, so I got some clips here of this woman talking about their changes at The Guardian. These clips provided by the No Agenda show, so thank you to them, because I couldn't find the actual video clip or any audio clips. But here, let's just play these. It's perfect. Gives you a perfect example of how they're trying to manipulate you into their agenda.
Yeah, well, it was really prompted in the first instance by the fact that The Guardian felt that we needed to change our language around the way we were talking about these stories. It seemed that our environmental journalists were reporting a much more kind of serious level of tone from scientists. So we discussed that what we were kind of dealing with really was not just climate change, but actually a kind of a catastrophic crisis. So what we realized was it was no longer appropriate to have quite kind of benign or passive images that went with this kind of serious change in tone. So, you know, kind of historically, we had perhaps used pictures of polar bears on melting icebergs, etc.
If you don't know about the polar bears on melting icebergs, that was propaganda, and it wasn't true. And maybe we'll talk about that later if you don't know. But you can look it up. There's people that show how that was propaganda.
And you know, the picture of the polar bear feels like something that's quite remote and doesn't necessarily affect, you know, the human being reading the story at home.
So they want to affect you into changing your mind. They want to affect you into believing this. And by the way, again, that was propaganda, but it isn't quite effective enough. It seemed quite effective at the time. Everybody was sharing those stories, but it must not be effective enough anymore, maybe because people found out it was fake.
And so what kind of images did you feel would have a bigger effect if you were to use?
Okay, well, it really is about human engagement. And so the effects of the climate change and the climate crisis on human beings became a more sort of appropriate way of illustrating these stories. So it is about the direct effect on human beings. So what we started to show in that case was, you know, kind of people who were sort of suffering from the effects of desperate pollution, or the torment of people who'd lost their homes in wildfires.
Desperate pollution, people being affected by desperate pollution. And then, of course, show people affected by the wildfires. Get your emotions up and blame the wildfires on global warming, even though wildfires are a natural thing that always happen and is actually good for environments. And it's a natural part of the world. Just because we may happen to live in an area that gets affected by a wildfire, it's not because of global warming. Fires happen, right?
And it just kind of gives the illustration a much more of an immediate effect, and it's much more active, I would say.
It's much more active in manipulating your emotions. All right, here's the next one.
So you want them to have more of an emotional impact?
Indeed, yes. I mean, getting the emotional tone right is absolutely critical.
How does this compare to, or how does this complement what you've changed in the style guide of The Guardian?
So the language that we're using is much more active, I would say. And again, you know, it's less benign, it's less passive. The phrase climate change is quite passive compared to a catastrophe for humanity or a crisis. We also changed the phrase global warming, again, which sounds quite cozy, to global heating, which is a bit more sort of severe and sincere. So it did feel that to kind of use pictures of, you know, very appealing creatures was not entirely appropriate with this kind of change in tone.
It's more sincere and more fearful. And we don't want to use cute fuzzy wuzzies anymore, because those things might leave you in a state of thinking about cute animals and not thinking about yourself and how scary this world is in the new climate crisis.
Well, as well-intentioned as this might be, at what point does this cross the line from journalism to propaganda?
That is a great question, huh? I commend this woman for asking that question, because most journalists, so-called, would just be in total agreement with this lady and just be congratulating her and building her up on this.
Propaganda, I think, is probably quite an extreme accusation.
But no, I guess because of using emotional images in order to provoke a certain effect would be how propaganda would work. With what you want to say, advocacy. What point do you cross the line away from journalism to advocacy?
And this is a good point too, because if you pay attention, many of these journalists are not journalists, they're activists working as journalists. They're activists that are just trying to get you to side with them and to take up their activism. And that's why you see all these stupid protests with the children, because it's propagated by the media. I mean, this is another thing. All these protests going on around the world with children skipping school, and they play this stuff and they prop it up in the media. But did you know that there is people all around the world right now in protests against their governments, against policies for different reasons, but the media never shows it and they never talk about it. And I'll try to do a video on that later, but it's hard to find video. There's only people basically just recording it on cell phones and whatnot. But this is a great point that this lady is bringing up. When does this propaganda or activism cross the line?
Propaganda, or whatever word you might want to use.
Well, I think what we have to do is stay really close to what the science is telling us and how our journalists are interpreting that. And if we do
what the science is telling us and how our journalists are interpreting the science. And what science are they using? The so-called science report, where all the scientists, there's a consensus that humans are causing global warming. That science, the science that doesn't exist.
Do that, then we are being kind of accurate and appropriate in the images that we select. What we need to do is kind of be accurate in, and sincere about the tone of the journalism.
So when you use catastrophe for humanity instead of climate change, you feel that is being more accurate as opposed to being sensationalized?
I think, honestly, that our journalists here do believe that this is a catastrophe, and this is why we've changed the language. And it's also been described.
Our journalists do believe that this is a catastrophe, and that's why we've changed the language. We do believe.
As a climate crisis by the United Nations Secretary General. So it's becoming a kind of an accepted theme. But again, it is based on, the science that our journalists are interpreting.
It's based on the science that our journalists are interpreting. Shouldn't they just be reporting the so-called science? Should they be interpreting it for you so that they can manipulate you emotionally into taking up their climate activism? That's not journalism, that's activism, that's propaganda, and it's BS. Anyway, I hope this might have enlightened somebody into how this is going on, and I mean, it's straight from the wolf's mouths. This is how it works. It's climate activism straight to you through the media. Take care and God bless.